In the history of violent crime, few names have become as recognizable or as deeply unsettling as Ted Bundy. For years, investigators searched for a killer who seemed to vanish as quickly as he appeared. Young women disappeared from college campuses, shopping centers, and quiet neighborhoods. Some were last seen speaking to a polite stranger, others simply never returned home. There was no obvious pattern that the public could see, no dark alley predator hiding in the shadows, no mysterious drifter living on the edge of society. Instead, witnesses repeatedly described someone who appeared trustworthy. He was well-spoken, well-dressed, educated, someone who smiled easily, someone who could ask for help without raising suspicion. Behind that carefully crafted image, however, was a man responsible for one of the deadliest serial murder sprees in American history. His crimes stretched across multiple states, challenged law enforcement agencies that struggled to share information, and exposed how easily appearances could conceal unimaginable violence. For decades, people have tried to answer a question that still echoes today. How could so many intelligent, cautious people trust a man capable of such extraordinary cruelty? The answer is far more complicated than simple deception. It is a story about manipulation, about charisma used as a weapon, about victims whose lives were interrupted without warning, and families forced to live with questions that would never fully disappear. This is not the story of a criminal mastermind or an untouchable monster. It is the story of how an ordinary-looking man exploited trust, opportunity, and human nature to hide in plain sight. This is Ted Bundy, falling for a killer. The early 1970s was a decade of change in the United States. The optimism that had defined much of the previous generation was beginning to fade. The country was still recovering from the social upheaval of the 1960s. The Vietnam War divided public opinion. The Watergate scandal would soon shake confidence in government. Across the nation, Americans found themselves living through a period of uncertainty, yet everyday life continued. College campuses expanded as more young people pursued higher education. Suburban neighborhoods grew. Shopping centers became gathering places for families and students alike. Hitchhiking remained common, especially among young adults traveling short distances between schools, concerts, and home. People generally believed that communities were safe. Parents expected their children to return home after classes. Friends thought nothing of walking across campus after dark. A stranger asking for directions or requesting help with carrying books was often met with kindness rather than suspicion. It was a time when trust was woven into daily life. Law enforcement operated very differently than it does today. There were no smartphones recording every encounter. Security cameras were rare outside banks and a handful of businesses. DNA analysis did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Fingerprint databases were limited, and information sharing between police departments was often slow and fragmented. When someone disappeared, investigators frequently treated the case as a voluntary absence rather than a possible crime. Adults were generally believed to have the right to leave without informing anyone. Hours, and sometimes days, could pass before a disappearance received serious investigative attention. If crimes crossed state lines, the challenges multiplied. Police departments kept separate records, used different investigative methods, and often had little way of knowing that detectives hundreds of miles away were working on remarkably similar cases. This gap in communication would become one of the greatest advantages for a predator who refused to stay in one place. At the same time, the country was becoming increasingly aware of violent crime. News reports covered a growing number of unsolved disappearances and homicides. Yet the term serial killer had not entered everyday language. Criminal profilers, as they are known today, were still in the earliest stages of development. Investigators rarely imagined that one individual could be responsible for a series of murders committed across multiple jurisdictions. Each case was often viewed in isolation. A missing college student in one state appeared unrelated to a homicide hundreds of miles away. Without modern databases or coordinated national investigations, crucial connections could remain hidden for months. This environment created dangerous blind spots. Young women, particularly college students, embraced new freedoms. Many lived away from home for the first time. They attended evening classes, worked part-time jobs, and enjoyed the independence that came with campus life. Most had little reason to believe that accepting help from a polite stranger could place them in extraordinary danger. That assumption would soon be tested. Across the Pacific Northwest, investigators would begin receiving reports that seemed unrelated at first. A student failed to arrive home. Another vanished after running errands, then another. The disappearances appeared random. There were few witnesses, even fewer clues. Families searched desperately for answers while police struggled to determine whether any crime had occurred at all. What no one realized was that these cases were not isolated incidents. A pattern was quietly emerging. The man responsible did not fit the image most people associated with violent offenders. He did not lurk in abandoned buildings or hide his face behind a mask. He blended into crowds, attended classes, held conversations with ease, and projected an image of confidence and intelligence. His greatest weapon was not physical strength, it was the trust he inspired. Long before the nation learned his name, Ted Bundy was already perfecting the deception that would allow him to move unnoticed through communities across America. And before investigators understood they were hunting one man, countless lives had already been changed forever. Long before his name became associated with one of the most infamous serial murder cases in American history, Theodore Robert Bundy appeared to be an ambitious young man with a promising future. To neighbors, classmates, co-workers, and even those closest to him, there was little reason to believe he was capable of extraordinary violence. He was articulate, intelligent, and socially confident. He could discuss politics, law, current events, or everyday life with equal ease. He smiled often, dressed neatly, and carried himself with quiet confidence. First impressions mattered to Bundy. He understood that people naturally judged character through appearance and behavior. Rather than fighting those assumptions, he carefully cultivated them. He wanted to appear respectable, dependable, successful, and for many years, he succeeded. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried when he was born, a circumstance that carried significant social stigma during the 1940s. For the first years of his life, Bundy was raised in the home of his maternal grandparents. Family members presented his grandparents as his parents, while his biological mother was introduced as his older sister. The reasons for this arrangement reflected the social pressures of the era, when many unmarried mothers faced intense public judgment. Only later did Bundy learn the truth about his birth. For decades, psychologists and biographers debated whether this revelation influenced his later life. Some viewed it as emotionally significant, while others cautioned against drawing direct conclusions. Millions of people experience painful childhoods without becoming violent offenders. There is no single event that explains Ted Bundy's crimes. His childhood, while complicated, does not provide a simple answer. When his mother later married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, the family moved to Tacoma, Washington. Johnny formally adopted Ted, giving him the surname that would later become known around the world. Johnny Bundy was generally described by relatives as hardworking and dependable. Ted rarely spoke of him with affection. Instead, he often portrayed his adoptive father as unremarkable, though many people who knew the family disputed that characterization. As Bundy entered adolescence, he became increasingly aware of how others perceived him. Acceptance mattered, status mattered, success mattered. Former classmates remembered him differently. Some described him as friendly but somewhat reserved. Others recalled moments when he appeared shy and uncertain. Still others remembered a young man eager to fit in but careful not to reveal too much about himself. These differing impressions became a recurring pattern throughout his life. People often believed they knew the real Ted Bundy. In reality, many only knew the version he chose to present. After graduating from high school, Bundy attended several colleges before enrolling at the University of Washington. Although his academic journey was not always straightforward, he demonstrated genuine intelligence and developed interests in psychology, politics, and eventually law. Outside the classroom, he became involved in political campaigns. Campaign staff remembered an energetic volunteer who worked diligently and communicated comfortably with both colleagues and public officials. He appeared ambitious and eager to build a meaningful career. He also accepted positions that reflected public trust. For a period, Bundy volunteered at a crisis hotline in Seattle, speaking with people experiencing emotional distress. Those who worked beside him remembered someone patient, compassionate, and composed under pressure. Among his co-workers was Ann Rule, a former police officer who would later become one of America's most respected true crime authors. Rule found Bundy intelligent, courteous, and dependable. Like everyone else who knew him at the time, she had no reason to suspect he was living a hidden life. Her later reflections revealed one of the most unsettling truths about the case. Bundy did not appear dangerous. He appeared trustworthy. Away from work, Bundy developed romantic relationships that further reinforced this image. Friends described him as attentive, affectionate, and thoughtful. He spoke confidently about the future. He discussed career ambitions. He seemed to be building the life of an educated young professional. One early relationship with a woman widely identified under the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks left a lasting emotional impression. Coming from a more affluent background, she represented the successful life Bundy desperately wanted. When the relationship ended, Bundy appeared determined to reinvent himself. He refined his appearance, improved his confidence, worked harder to project success. Some writers have suggested that the breakup deeply affected him. Others argue there is no evidence linking that disappointment directly to the crimes that followed. The available evidence supports only one conclusion. His transformation into a serial murderer cannot be explained by the end of a single relationship. By the late 1960s, Bundy began another serious relationship with Elizabeth Kendall, also identified by a pseudonym to protect her privacy. Elizabeth was a divorced mother raising a young daughter near Seattle. She remembered meeting a charming young man who seemed genuinely interested in building a future together. He was affectionate, responsible, attentive to her daughter. He talked about marriage. He shared ordinary family moments that gave every appearance of stability. Friends saw nothing unusual. The couple attended social gatherings, enjoyed evenings together, and appeared to be living an ordinary life. Looking back years later, Elizabeth recalled moments that seemed strange in hindsight, but at the time they were easily dismissed. Nothing she experienced pointed clearly toward the horrifying reality investigators would eventually uncover. Like countless others, she trusted him because he gave her every reason to. This ability to separate one part of his life from another became one of Bundy's defining characteristics. He compartmentalized with remarkable discipline. One moment he was a loving boyfriend, another a dedicated volunteer, an ambitious political worker, a law student. Each role appeared genuine because he invested himself completely in maintaining it. Very few people ever saw contradictions. Bundy understood something fundamental about human behavior. Trust is rarely earned through dramatic gestures. It develops through countless ordinary interactions. A polite greeting, a thoughtful conversation, a calm voice, reliable behavior repeated over time. He carefully studied those expectations and learned how to meet them. The result was a public image that inspired confidence rather than suspicion. This carefully maintained persona would later become one of the most powerful tools in his criminal life. Investigators eventually concluded that Bundy frequently approached women in ways designed to appear completely harmless. Several witnesses described encountering a polite young man whose arm appeared injured. Sometimes it rested in a sling. Other times it appeared to be supported by what looked like a cast. He politely asked for assistance carrying books or loading a sailboat onto his Volkswagen Beetle. The request sounded reasonable. Helping an injured stranger was a natural act of kindness. There was no shouting, no immediate threat, no behavior that obviously suggested danger. Witnesses often recalled seeing women voluntarily walking beside him while carrying on normal conversations. To everyone nearby, nothing seemed unusual. That normality was precisely what Bundy depended upon. Rather than relying on intimidation, he relied on appearance. Rather than forcing trust, he encouraged people to offer it willingly. His greatest weapon was not physical strength. It was his ability to convince others that he deserved their confidence. The women who encountered Ted Bundy were not reckless. They behaved exactly as most decent people would behave when approached by someone who appeared polite, educated, and temporarily in need of assistance. Bundy exploited empathy itself. As he continued moving through daily life, another story was quietly unfolding across the Pacific Northwest. Young women began disappearing. At first, each case appeared isolated. A college student failed to return after class. Another disappeared while shopping. Someone else vanished after leaving campus. Families waited through long nights hoping for a telephone call that never came. Search parties organized across parks, forests, and neighborhoods. Missing person posters appeared on bulletin boards and storefront windows. Investigators faced enormous challenges. There were no smartphones recording daily movements. Surveillance cameras were uncommon. DNA analysis was still years away. Many disappearances were initially treated as isolated incidents involving adults who had chosen to leave voluntarily. The possibility that one individual could be responsible for multiple disappearances across different communities seemed unlikely. Meanwhile, Bundy continued living an apparently ordinary life. He attended classes, he worked, he maintained relationships, he smiled for photographs. He spent evenings with Elizabeth and her daughter. The contrast was chilling. While families searched desperately for daughters, sisters, and friends, Bundy continued blending effortlessly into everyday society. For those closest to him, accepting the growing suspicions proved almost impossible. Elizabeth Kendall occasionally noticed similarities between news reports and her boyfriend. The suspect reportedly drove a Volkswagen Beetle. So did Ted. The physical descriptions sounded vaguely familiar. Even his first name occasionally surfaced in witness accounts. Troubled by these similarities, Elizabeth contacted law enforcement more than once, but investigators received thousands of tips. Volkswagen Beetles were among the most common cars on American roads. The descriptions remained broad. At that stage, there was simply not enough evidence to distinguish Bundy from countless other young men living in the region. Even Elizabeth questioned her own concerns. The thoughtful man she loved seemed completely incompatible with the crimes being described on television and in newspapers. Her uncertainty reflected the challenge facing investigators. Bundy had spent years building an identity that appeared authentic. Co-workers trusted him. Friends welcomed him into their homes. Political colleagues respected him. Women enjoyed his company. Nothing about his public life resembled the image most people associated with violent offenders. That contradiction became one of the defining lessons of the case. Ted Bundy did not hide in abandoned buildings or isolated wilderness. He hid behind normalcy. He succeeded because he understood how people naturally evaluated character. A pleasant smile, good manners, education, confidence. These qualities created a powerful illusion of safety. Years later, criminologists would identify Bundy as one of the clearest examples of organized predatory behavior in modern criminal history, not because he appeared monstrous, but because he appeared entirely ordinary. By the time investigators began recognizing that the disappearances might be connected, Bundy had already refined the deception that made him so difficult to identify. The carefully constructed image of an ambitious young man remained intact, but it would not remain untouched for much longer. On a warm summer day in Washington, surrounded by hundreds of people enjoying an afternoon outdoors, Ted Bundy would make a mistake that changed the investigation forever. For the first time, multiple witnesses would remember not only the man they had seen, but the name he had willingly given them. By the beginning of 1974, something troubling was unfolding across the Pacific Northwest. At first, there was no clear pattern, no obvious connection, no reason to believe that a single individual was responsible. Each disappearance seemed like an isolated tragedy, separated by different locations, different circumstances, and different lives. For the families left behind, however, the details mattered far less than the silence that followed. A daughter failed to return home. A roommate waited through the night. Parents answered telephones with growing desperation, hoping every ring would bring good news. Instead, the days passed without answers. On the evening of January 4th, 1974, 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a student at the University of Washington, was attacked while sleeping in her basement bedroom in Seattle. She survived the assault but suffered catastrophic injuries that left her unable to describe her attacker. Because there were no eyewitnesses and few immediate leads, investigators treated the attack as a violent but isolated crime. No one knew that it might represent the beginning of something much larger. Just over a month later, on February 1st, another young woman vanished. 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy was a psychology student at the University of Washington. She was known for her reliability and discipline. Alongside her studies, she worked as a morning radio weather reporter, waking before dawn to prepare for her broadcasts. On the morning she disappeared, her routine suddenly stopped. Her roommates noticed something unusual. Her bed had been stripped. There were small traces of blood in the bedroom. Her nightgown was missing. Yet there were no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle. It appeared as though someone had entered the house during the night, attacked her while she slept, and removed her from the home before anyone else awoke. For investigators, the scene was deeply unsettling. Linda had simply vanished. Weeks passed with no confirmed sightings. Her family searched relentlessly, refusing to abandon hope. Friends distributed flyers throughout Seattle, but no explanation emerged. As winter gave way to spring, more disappearances followed. On March 12th, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson left Evergreen State College in Olympia to attend a jazz concert on campus. She never arrived. The campus was searched extensively. Nearby roads and wooded areas were examined. There was no indication of where she had gone. To investigators, it appeared as though she had simply disappeared while walking a familiar route. Less than a month later, on April 17th, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt vanished after attending an evening lecture at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. She was last seen leaving the campus library. Her friends expected her to return to her dormitory. She never did. Despite organized searches involving students, volunteers, and law enforcement, Susan's whereabouts remained unknown. The growing list of missing young women began attracting wider attention. Still, authorities struggled to determine whether the cases were connected. Each investigation belonged to a different jurisdiction. Each department possessed only part of the overall picture. Without modern computerized databases or coordinated information sharing systems, similarities that seem obvious today were far more difficult to recognize. Then on May 6th, another disappearance deepened investigators' concerns. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22 years old, left Oregon State University after meeting friends. She intended to walk a short distance to her residence. She never completed the journey. Again, there were no reliable witnesses, no clear motive, no obvious suspect. Her disappearance crossed into another state, creating additional challenges for investigators attempting to compare evidence with cases in Washington. Only a few weeks later, on June 1st, 20-year-old Brenda Carroll Ball disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, Washington. Friends expected her to return home after work. Instead, she vanished without explanation. The similarities were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The victims were young women, many were students. Several disappeared near college campuses or while traveling alone. Yet no one had witnessed a violent confrontation. There were no public reports of masked attackers or armed kidnappers. The women seemed to disappear almost silently. Detectives from different jurisdictions began speaking with one another more frequently. Missing person reports were compared. Photographs were examined side by side. Investigators searched for common acquaintances, vehicles, or locations. The challenge was enormous. There was still very little physical evidence linking the cases together. Meanwhile, life across the Pacific Northwest continued. University campuses remained crowded. Summer approached. Students prepared for final examinations, vacations, and graduation ceremonies. Most people remained unaware that a predator was moving among them. The disappearances were receiving media attention, but few imagined that one individual could be responsible. Ted Bundy continued living what appeared to be an ordinary life. He attended classes, maintained relationships, volunteered, spoke about future ambitions. Nothing about his public routine suggested he was connected to the growing number of missing women. This ability to preserve normalcy while violence unfolded elsewhere became one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. As later evidence revealed, Bundy carefully selected circumstances that minimized attention. He avoided crowded confrontations. He exploited moments when a woman was briefly alone. He understood familiar environments, college campuses, parking lots, sidewalks, and shopping areas, because they allowed him to blend effortlessly into the surroundings. Witnesses who encountered him rarely remembered anything remarkable. That perhaps was the most remarkable detail of all. He looked like everyone else. As spring turned into summer, detectives recognized that the disappearances were becoming more than a series of isolated missing person cases. Some investigators quietly began discussing the possibility that they were searching for a single offender. It was a disturbing theory. If true, it meant the person responsible had already struck repeatedly without being identified. It also meant he was almost certainly preparing to strike again. Across Washington state, police agencies increased communication and urged the public to remain alert. Families warned daughters to avoid traveling alone whenever possible. Universities shared safety advice with students. Yet the warnings remained general because investigators still did not know exactly who or what they were looking for. The man responsible continued moving freely through the communities he had come to understand so well. He remained patient, calculated, confident that his carefully crafted public image would shield him from suspicion. Then, on a warm Saturday in July 1974, everything changed. At a crowded lakeside park filled with families, swimmers, and hundreds of witnesses, the unknown predator abandoned the anonymity that had protected him for months. For the first time, multiple people would remember not only his face, but the simple name he introduced himself with: Ted. Saturday, July 14th, 1974 began like countless summer weekends in Washington state. The weather was warm, the skies were clear. Families packed picnic baskets and beach towels before making their way to Lake Sammamish State Park, located just east of Seattle. By midday, thousands of visitors filled the park. Children played along the shoreline. Boats drifted across the water. Groups of friends spread blankets across the grass, enjoying one of the hottest afternoons of the year. It was the last place anyone expected to witness the movements of a serial predator. Unlike his earlier crimes, this was not an isolated neighborhood or a quiet college campus. This was one of the busiest public parks in the region. Everywhere people looked, there were potential witnesses. Yet Ted Bundy was confident. He had spent months refining an approach that depended not on force, but on persuasion. That afternoon, several visitors noticed an attractive young man walking through the park. His left arm appeared to be injured. Some remembered it resting in a sling. Others recalled what looked like a plaster cast. He carried himself politely, never appearing rushed or aggressive. His request was simple. He needed help loading a small sailboat onto the roof of his bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. He approached young women individually. His voice was calm. His manner was respectful. Some declined and continued enjoying their day. Others spoke with him briefly before walking away. Each encounter lasted only moments. Nothing about the conversation seemed alarming. Witnesses later described him as clean-cut, articulate, and unusually charming. Several remembered one additional detail. When introducing himself, he simply said his name was Ted. That small piece of information would later become one of the most important breakthroughs in the investigation. During the afternoon, 23-year-old Janice Ott accepted his request for assistance. Janice worked as a caseworker and had come to the park to spend the day outdoors. Friends expected to meet her later that evening. She was never seen alive again. Only a few hours later, another young woman encountered the same polite stranger. Denise Marie Naslund was 18 years old. She had come to Lake Sammamish with her boyfriend and friends for an afternoon of swimming and relaxing. At some point, Denise left her group to walk toward the restroom. She never returned. Initially, those with her assumed she had gone elsewhere in the crowded park. As time passed, concern turned into panic. A search began almost immediately. Friends called her name. Park visitors joined the effort. Law enforcement quickly arrived and began examining the area. By nightfall, 2 young women had disappeared from one of the busiest recreational areas in Washington. The coincidence seemed almost impossible. Investigators immediately recognized that these disappearances differed from earlier cases. This time, there were witnesses, lots of them. Dozens of park visitors reported speaking with or seeing the same young man throughout the day. For the first time, detectives were able to construct a detailed description of someone who had been interacting with multiple women shortly before 2 disappearances. Witnesses consistently described him as a white male in his 20s, tall, slim, well-groomed, dark hair, pleasant smile, soft-spoken, driving a bronze or tan Volkswagen Beetle. Most importantly, many remembered the name he had introduced himself with, Ted. Police artists worked with eyewitnesses to produce a composite sketch. When it was released to the public, newspapers across Washington printed the image alongside reports describing the disappearances. The sketch represented something investigators had not possessed before: a face. Telephone lines quickly filled with tips. Hundreds of callers believed they recognized the man in the drawing. Some identified co-workers, others named neighbors or acquaintances. Among those making calls was Elizabeth Kendall. As she studied the sketch and listened to news reports describing a man named Ted who drove a Volkswagen Beetle, an overwhelming sense of unease returned. The similarities were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Her boyfriend was named Ted. He drove the same type of vehicle. His appearance closely resembled the composite released by investigators. Despite her doubts, she contacted authorities once again. Like many others, she struggled with an impossible contradiction. The caring man she knew did not resemble the predator described by investigators. She feared she might be wrong. She also feared she might be right. Her information joined thousands of other tips arriving from across the region. Detectives carefully reviewed each report. At that stage, however, Bundy's name did not stand out strongly enough to move to the top of the suspect list. There simply was not enough evidence. The investigation continued. Search teams expanded their efforts around Lake Sammamish and surrounding wooded areas. Helicopters surveyed the landscape. Divers searched sections of the lake. Volunteers combed trails in nearby forests. Days passed without success. Then in September 1974, searchers made a grim discovery in a wooded area near Issaquah, not far from the lake. Human remains belonging to Janice Ott and Denise Naslin were recovered. The discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears. The disappearances were not isolated missing person cases, they were homicides. As forensic examinations continued, detectives recognized disturbing similarities between these victims and several women who had vanished earlier that year. The investigation suddenly expanded beyond Lake Sammamish. Cases from Seattle, Olympia, Ellensburg, Oregon. They all demanded another look. The possibility that one individual had committed all of these crimes was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. For the first time, law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions began coordinating their efforts more aggressively. Detectives exchanged reports, compared timelines, reviewed witness statements, examined vehicle descriptions, and studied the growing list of missing women with fresh urgency. The composite sketch circulated throughout the Pacific Northwest. So did the description of the bronze Volkswagen Beetle. The name Ted became one of the most discussed clues in the investigation. Yet it also created a problem. Thousands of men were named Ted. Volkswagen Beetles were among the most common cars on American roads. Without additional evidence, investigators still faced an enormous field of possible suspects. Meanwhile, the man at the center of the investigation remained free. He continued attending classes, maintained relationships, socialized with friends, spoke confidently about his future. To those around him, nothing appeared different. The largest manhunt of his life had quietly begun, and he was living in the middle of it. But the events at Lake Sammamish changed something fundamental. For months, Bundy had operated almost invisibly. Now witnesses had seen him, remembered him, described him, and unknowingly handed investigators the first pieces of the puzzle that would eventually expose one of America's most notorious serial killers. The hunt for the man called Ted was no longer a search through darkness. It had finally begun to take shape. The question was no longer whether he existed. The question was whether detectives could identify him before he found another victim. The events at Lake Sammamish transformed the investigation. For the first time, detectives were no longer working entirely in the dark. The disappearances of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund had unfolded in front of hundreds of people. Witnesses had spoken to the same man. They had described the same vehicle. Many even remembered the name he had casually introduced himself with. Ted. It was the strongest lead investigators had received since the first young women began disappearing months earlier, yet it was also frustratingly incomplete. A first name alone was not enough. Thousands of men in the Pacific Northwest were named Ted. The bronze Volkswagen Beetle described by witnesses was one of the most common cars on American roads. The composite sketch generated hundreds of telephone calls, but few produced information that could be verified. Detectives found themselves surrounded by possibilities, yet still lacking proof. As investigators compared reports from Washington and Oregon, another realization slowly took shape. The victims shared striking similarities. Most were young women. Several were college students. Many had dark hair parted down the middle, a hairstyle popular during the early 1970s. Some disappeared while walking alone. Others vanished during ordinary daily activities that gave them little reason to expect danger. There were no signs that they knew one another, no shared social circle, no common workplace, no obvious motive. Instead, investigators began considering a different possibility. Perhaps the women themselves were not connected. Perhaps they had simply been chosen by the same offender. This represented a significant shift in thinking. Until then, many missing person investigations had been handled independently, each confined to the jurisdiction where the disappearance occurred. Now detectives were beginning to look beyond county and state boundaries. They laid maps across conference tables, pinned photographs to bulletin boards, marked the locations where each woman had last been seen. Slowly, a geographic pattern began to emerge. Most of the disappearances clustered around western Washington. Others stretched into neighboring Oregon. The distances suggested someone who was comfortable traveling between communities without attracting attention. The offender appeared mobile, organized, patient. Rather than acting impulsively, he seemed willing to wait for opportunities that suited him. Investigators also noticed another troubling detail. There was often very little physical evidence. The victims vanished quickly. Witnesses rarely reported hearing screams or seeing violent confrontations. In many cases, personal belongings remained behind, while the women themselves seemed to disappear without explanation. This indicated careful planning. The offender understood how to approach people without creating immediate alarm. He relied on conversation rather than intimidation. He exploited moments when a woman was briefly separated from friends or family. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, he was already gone. As these conclusions developed, detectives from different agencies began working together more closely than before. One of the investigators who played an increasingly important role was Robert Keppel, a detective with the King County Sheriff's Office. Keppel believed the disappearances could no longer be viewed as unrelated cases. He encouraged greater cooperation between jurisdictions and helped organize the growing volume of information. Forensic scientists, homicide investigators, and missing person specialists pooled evidence that had previously remained scattered across multiple departments. Even so, significant obstacles remained. Computers capable of rapidly comparing case files did not exist in modern form. Records were maintained on paper, photographs were mailed between agencies, telephone calls replaced instant communication. Critical information often took days or weeks to reach the detectives who needed it. The investigation moved forward through persistence rather than technology. Meanwhile, the public grew increasingly uneasy. Newspapers carried stories about the disappearances almost daily. Parents warned daughters to avoid traveling alone. Universities encouraged students to walk in groups after dark. Friends altered their routines. Simple acts that had once seemed ordinary, walking to class, shopping alone, accepting help from a stranger, began to feel less certain. The Pacific Northwest was changing. Fear spread gradually, not through panic, but through quiet adjustments to everyday life. People locked doors more often. Young women paid closer attention to unfamiliar faces. Communities that had long considered themselves safe were beginning to recognize that something extraordinary was happening. Still, no one knew where the offender would strike next. While investigators worked to identify the man called Ted, he continued moving freely through society. His routine appeared unchanged. He attended the University of Washington School of Law. He maintained relationships with friends and colleagues. He visited Elizabeth Kendall and spent time with her daughter. He participated in ordinary conversations about work, politics, and the future. Nothing in his public behavior reflected the massive investigation unfolding around him. That contradiction baffled investigators once Bundy was eventually identified. Many violent offenders withdraw from normal life as pressure increases. Bundy appeared capable of doing the opposite. He preserved the appearance of stability even as the search for him intensified. It was another example of his remarkable ability to compartmentalize different parts of his life. As the months passed, search teams made additional discoveries that strengthened investigators' belief that the cases were connected. In September 1974, hunters searching wooded areas east of Seattle located skeletal remains belonging to Janice Ott and Denise Nestland. Nearby, investigators also recovered remains later identified as Susan Rancourt and Roberta Kathleen Parks. The discoveries confirmed that the missing women had not simply disappeared, they had been murdered. The remote locations where the remains were found suggested deliberate efforts to conceal the crimes. For investigators, these scenes provided valuable forensic evidence, though the passage of time and environmental conditions limited what could be recovered. Even so, the discoveries reinforced an increasingly clear picture of the offender. He was familiar with isolated terrain, comfortable returning to remote areas, confident enough to transport victims without drawing attention. As detectives assembled these pieces, the investigation expanded once again. Reports from neighboring states were reviewed for similar disappearances. Law enforcement agencies throughout the western United States were asked to remain alert. Although no one realized it at the time, the man responsible was already preparing to leave Washington. The growing pressure from investigators had not stopped him. It had simply encouraged him to change locations. Before long, a new series of disappearances would begin hundreds of miles away. Different state, different victims, the same carefully practiced methods. The pattern that had first appeared in Washington was about to cross state lines, creating an investigation unlike anything American law enforcement had confronted before. The hunt for the man called Ted was no longer confined to the Pacific Northwest. It was becoming a search that would eventually stretch across much of the country, and the killer remained one step ahead. By the autumn of 1974, investigators across Washington had reached a troubling conclusion. The disappearances were not random. The similarities between the victims, the witness statements from Lake Sammamish, and the recovery of human remains in remote wooded areas all pointed toward a single offender. Detectives no longer believed they were searching for multiple suspects. Somewhere, one man was moving freely through the Pacific Northwest, selecting victims, concealing evidence, and leaving almost nothing behind. Yet despite months of investigation, he remained unidentified. The composite sketch had generated thousands of leads. The name Ted had become one of the most discussed clues in the region. The bronze Volkswagen Beetle had been reported repeatedly. Still, none of it was enough to produce an arrest. While detectives concentrated on Washington, the offender quietly changed his hunting ground. Late in 1974, Ted Bundy relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah. On the surface, the move appeared entirely ordinary. He had enrolled at the University of Utah's law school and was continuing the life he had carefully constructed for years. He rented an apartment, attended classes, made new acquaintances, applied for jobs. To those around him, he appeared to be another ambitious graduate student beginning a new chapter of his life. Few people in Utah knew about the growing investigation hundreds of miles away. Even fewer had reason to connect the polite law student to the disappearances dominating headlines in Washington. The distance worked in Bundy's favor. At the time, police agencies shared information far less efficiently than they do today. There was no centralized national database capable of instantly comparing missing person reports, witness descriptions, or suspect information across multiple states. Each jurisdiction largely investigated its own cases. Cross-state communication depended on telephone calls, mailed reports, and personal cooperation between detectives. Those delays created opportunities. Bundy understood them well. Not long after arriving in Utah, another young woman disappeared. On October 18, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox vanished while walking through Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. She was heading toward a nearby telephone booth after leaving home. She never arrived. Searches produced no immediate answers. Friends and family waited for news that never came. Weeks later, another disappearance shook the community. On October 31st, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, the daughter of Midvale Police Chief Lewis Smith, disappeared after leaving a pizza restaurant. When she failed to return home, concern spread quickly. Unlike many previous victims, Melissa's father was himself a law enforcement officer. The investigation began immediately. Search teams worked tirelessly. 9 days later, Melissa's body was discovered in a mountainous area southeast of Salt Lake City. The case struck deeply within Utah's law enforcement community. This was no longer a distant tragedy reported from another state. One of their own officers had lost a daughter. The urgency of the investigation intensified. Only weeks later, on November 8th, 17-year-old Laura Amey disappeared after leaving a cafe in Lehi, Utah. Her remains were later found in a remote canyon. The similarities between the cases became increasingly difficult to ignore. The victims were young. Most had disappeared while alone. The attacks appeared carefully planned. The offender left little evidence behind. Investigators in Utah began recognizing the same characteristics that detectives in Washington had observed months earlier. Although no definitive connection had yet been established between the states, experienced investigators sensed they were confronting the same type of offender. The hunt had finally begun, but Ted Bundy was still one step ahead. In Part 2, we'll follow the investigation across multiple states, uncover the evidence that finally exposed him, and reveal how 2 shocking prison escapes led to his deadliest crimes. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories based on verified facts, court records, and official investigations. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that the most unsettling mysteries are often the ones hidden in plain sight.